New in the last 5 minutes, Australia, US vote against sending war crimes probe to Gaza. In the last 4 hours, UN sets up probe into Gaza killings. Yesterday UAE concern over plight of Palestinians in Gaza. UK abstention from UN vote on Gaza violence. Disgusting, says Labour. Iran calls on OIC to take serious actions against Israel's crimes in Gaza. UN votes to send investigators to Gaza. UN Human Rights Council investigates killings in Gaza. Israel is enraged. Australia votes against, but UN sets up probe into Gaza killings. UN to dispatch commission to probe Gaza massacre. UN's aid slams Israel's wholly disproportionate Gaza response. Australia and US oppose UN move for independent inquiry into Gaza violence. UN will investigate Israel's use of deadly force in Gaza protests. UN Human Rights Council to investigate violations in Gaza in the last 7 days. UN opens international probe into Israeli crimes in Gaza. Gaza border protests resume as UN calls for inquiry into Israeli response. Turkey says it will take Israel to the UN over Gaza shootings. Gaza border protests resume as UN calls for inquiry. Turkey's Erdogan says to raise Gaza violence at UN. General Assembly video, Israel vilified at UN. Body over Gaza killings. UN Human Rights Council to investigate Israel's killings in Gaza. Danan, Haley condemn UNHRC for decision to probe deadly Gaza events. UN to dispatch commission to probe Gaza killings. Erdogan calls on world's Muslims to back Palestinians in Gaza. Turkey's Erdogan say to take events in Gaza to UN. General Assembly Gaza updates. UN says killings by Israel amount. UN calls for war crimes investigation over Gaza violence. UN sets up human rights probe into Gaza killings. To Israel's fury, Turkey's Erdogan calls on world's Muslims to back Palestinians in Gaza. Israel condemns hypocrisy of UN Rights Council on Gaza. Independent mechanism to investigate Gaza events to be formed. UN Council. UN Human Rights Council votes to investigate Israel for Gaza protest deaths. UN Human Rights Chief, Gaza is a toxic slum. Top UN rights body votes for inquiry on Gaza clashes. UN votes to send war crimes investigators to Gaza. UN votes to send international war crimes probe to Gaza. UN votes to send war crimes probe to Gaza. Kuwait urges UN to deploy troops to protect Palestinians in Gaza. UN Human Rights Council holds emergency session on Gaza events. Israel's Gaza response, wholly disproportionate, says UN Rights Chief. UN inquiry approved into killing of 60 at Gaza offense. Gaza draft UN text backs international protection mission. UN Human Rights Council demands probe of Gaza deaths. Lieberman vows to defend troops amid calls for probe into Gaza clashes. Israel vilified at UN for Gaza killings, but backed by US UN Rights Chief. Israel's Gaza response, wholly disproportionate, and cycle of violence in Gaza. UN Deputy Chief. Israel vilified at UN. Body for Gaza killings, but backed by US. UN humanitarian coordinator urges support for injured, bereaved in Gaza. UN 1.9 million Gaza Strip residents caged in a toxic slum. Egypt opens Gaza border crossing for Ramadan. Israel cages Palestinians in toxic slum of Gaza, says UN Rights Chief. Little evidence. Israel tried to minimize Gaza deaths. UN Rights Chief backs Gaza inquiry. UN Rights Chief backs calls for probe over Gaza deaths. Syrian representative condemns Israeli Gaza massacre. In UNHRC session, UN Rights Chief backs investigation into Israeli killings in Gaza. UN, Gaza killings by Israel amount to war crime. Israel's Gaza response, disproportionate. Israel's Gaza response, wholly disproportionate. UN Rights Chief. Israel's Gaza response, wholly disproportionate. UN Rights Chief backs calls for inquiry over Gaza deaths. Israel keeps Gaza residents caged in a toxic slum. UN said Gaza residents caged in a toxic slum. UN Human Rights Chief said Israel keeps Gaza residents caged in a toxic slum. UN said UN must sending international war crimes probe to Gaza. Gaza. Egypt opens border crossing for month of Ramadan. Kuwait urges international force on Gaza border.